So with that, I want to introduce our first panel. Two of the most incredible labor leaders that I have had the opportunity to work with over the years. Erin Johansson from Jobs with Justice, an incredible organization. And Erin is a relentless advocate for employee rights. She's been involved in some of the most incredible, to me anyways, looking at a 20-year study of the labor movement, some of the most incredible movements that we've seen in 20 years in the labor movement. I mean, really, this to me, at least maybe I'm being hopeful, maybe I'm being overly optimistic, which is not normally in my personality, but to me, I think we're in this those of you who know me are probably like, yeah, sorry that students, when you leave the room, depressed at the end of the day, but just sometimes the reality leads to that. But this to me is, we're on the cusp of maybe this labor revitalization that we've been talking about for so many years. And it's not, because of traditional movements, but it's because of things that Erin has been involved in and Jobs with Justice have been directly involved with in fighting things that involve workers as a whole, and especially low-wage workers. And I don't know if I should mention the specifics, but all of you know what the specifics are if you're following it all. So I'll leave it at that. The other labor leader who I actually got to not just work with, but work with every day at Fairmont State University, Sue Kelly. Dr. Sue Kelly was a faculty member with me at Fairmont State University, an incredible labor organizer, was able to organize over 50% of the faculty at Fairmont State University in West Virginia, which is a state university, in case you missed it, state, right, university, in a state that should be surprising to many people, does not have collective bargaining rights for state workers. And so, there was no guarantee of being able to bargain or anything else. But despite that, she was able to do an incredible job of organizing the AFT union there, and I believe also driving out a bullying president of that university. This panel, we're going to talk a little bit about some labor issues and how those go along with dignity at work. Which order do you say?
Jerry asked me to speak first with specific examples of levels of bullying. I'm boots on the ground. I'm president of the AFT at Fairmont State. People call me constantly, whether they're in the union or not, for any kind of emotional support or anything else I can do for them. And excuse me, Jerry asked me to use specific examples, talk about specific examples. And I have examples that span the things that happen at the legislature in West Virginia, things that happen with classified staff, things that happen with faculty, and the bullying by the administration that students have undergone. So let me begin with specific cases. Two secretaries, one secretary having an affair with a student, the other secretary covering for the lustful secretary, we will call her, sometimes covering for her in her absence 3 or 4 hours at a time. Eventually, the lustful secretary is spoken to, gets angry, assumes it is the non-lustful secretary who has turned her in. It wasn't, it was a faculty member. Sends her lover sends death threats to the non-lustful secretary. The administration knows about this and intercepts some of the letters, even though they were state line crossed. The secretary, who had done nothing wrong, began to have all sorts of anxiety because her children had been threatened specifically. And the institution gave the other secretary the option to resign, which she did, meaning that there were no consequences for her behavior. while the remaining secretary was transferred to another division and is under threat. She feels as though since she caused trouble that within a year she'll be fired. And it won't be surprising if she is. She'll be told there are budget cuts and so forth and so on, and that's the way a lot of this bullying ends up with the idea that there are budget cuts and therefore it's not you, darling, we just don't have the money for you anymore, right? Another example in terms of compromising higher education, a Spanish teacher was told by her administrator that she had to give a second-year Spanish student who did not even know the word hola a passing grade so that she could graduate, so that the numbers of the institution's graduates would remain high. Remember, they get money per graduate. Total corruption of the higher education process, right? This woman did come to me, and we filed grievances, we worked on it, and what finally happened was she got a job someplace else, so the issue dropped. But in the process, the administration, even though I had had her go in and record her conversation with her chair, the administration position was, oh, there are always two sides to the story. Shoot me now, right? Oh, excuse me. In terms of students being bullied, our journalism department for 1 year had a fantastic journalist, pulled the program together, was told to pull the program together. He did so. The students wrote a story on mold in a dormitory. The supervisor of the journalism program was promptly not rehired, even though he had signed a 3-year contract. And the students, I even went in with them to a meeting with the president, the provost, and the CFO, during which time, let me back up just a moment. One student, when the article came out, was so bullied by the chair of the department that he was reduced to tears. And this is a young man who's incredibly smart, incredibly competent. He registered a complaint with the administration at the beginning of the year after all the national stories about this happening. All 3 administrators belittled the students during this meeting, did not take any of their complaints seriously, and required prior restraint. I don't know if you're familiar with journalism, but prior restraint is when you are told ahead of time what articles you're supposed to focus on and what articles you're supposed to publish. Completely different from what the students had learned and were practicing. The students finally refused to be editors any longer. They refused to cooperate with the administration, so that the administration ended up happy as a clam. They had hired to take this person's place, the supervisor's place. They hired somebody with a BA degree and 30 days experience in journalism. Again, corruption of an institution from the inside out. The last example I'm going to talk about, I was teaching a class on ecofeminism. And this was the time in West Virginia when fracking was just beginning to invade. And we were doing other things in ecofeminism, but then when the fracking started, we began to research that, and we finally invited to the class a legislator, a delegate, who was working on the state regulations for fracking. And he had worked for 2 years on a committee to institute these state regulations. I brought members of the class with me to the legislature on the day that the committee was proposing these changes and it was going to supposedly pass. Oh no, I talked to the Speaker of the House and to the Speaker of the Senate, both of whom said, we will do nothing to inhibit oil and gas in this state, and they completely gutted all regulations on fracking that this man had worked on for 2 years. They bullied him into making an announcement that he was happy with what had happened today, that he was happy with the outcome and West Virginians would be safer as a result. I would like to say BS, but you know, nobody is safer as a result, as those of you in Pennsylvania know. You already know what it's done. So my position is that bullying happens at every level, whether it's staff level, whether it's legislators, it doesn't matter. And the harm it causes is irreversible many times. And the people who are bullied seem to me to be pushed into corners constantly where they end up quitting. They end up throwing up their hands and saying, all right, I'm done. Right? And I'm union, and I do my best, but we have never won, at least at Fairmont State, we've never won a bullying case because everybody quits. Eventually, they quit. And I think we'd win if we'd only stay with it and get it through the grievance process and maybe set a precedent. But otherwise, people are so harmed by this, they quit, and we can't take it further. And it's incredibly frustrating for all of us. That's what I brought.
Thanks.
Yeah, of course it's uplifting. It's like, really?
Well, I would say what's uplifting is they have you, Sue,
Well,
as a champion. I really.
But it doesn't go anyway.
So I'm taking things at a bit more of a macro level, and just first, I really want to thank Professor Carbo here for inviting me and Sue because.
Me too. Thank you, Jerry.
Well, it was in conversations with Jerry that I've been working on this issue of what we've called for many, many years retaliation. When people who are taking collective action at work to raise wages or to ultimately form a union experience retaliation from their employers. We call it retaliation, but I love this bullying frame because I think it resonates more with people. People know what bullying is. Something about retaliation sounds like too legalese to me. So anyway, I'm excited to be here and to try to make that connection with the work that we've done for many years to sort of expose this retaliation. So just to take a step back a little, when you look at statistics on favorability, what Americans think about unions, the latest Pew survey found, I think it's usually about a little bit of over a majority of Americans view unions favorably. More significantly, a recent poll of people making less than $15 an hour found that 72% of those workers would like to form a union. So there's a lot of support for unions, especially among low-wage workers. Mm-hmm. But why is it that only 7%, less than 7% of private sector employees are in a union? Mm-hmm. So what's that gap? How do you explain that gap between wanting a union and not having one? And so, we posit at Jobs for Justice, as do many of our allies in the labor movement, and many academics who study the issue, that a lot of this is because of retaliation, both actual experience retaliation of employees by their employers, as well as perceived fear of retaliation is keeping people from forming unions or otherwise taking collective action. So if you look at research done, the most recent national study was done by Cornell University in 2009. Kate Bronfenbrenner's done amazing work in this area. She looked at efforts by people to form unions and found that 63% of those campaigns, employers had mandatory one-on-one meetings with your supervisor. Imagine the feeling of being threatened, having to sit with your supervisor and talk to the supervisor about the union effort. you're being interrogated. What do you think about the union? Who's working on this? Who's fighting this? Those are incredibly intimidating. In 57% of campaigns, she found that employers were actually threatening to shut down the operation if the employees voted for the union. And that's illegal, but we'll get to that. There's no teeth in the law. And in a third of campaigns, some pro-union supporters were actually fired. And imagine you've got a store of 300 employees. How many people do you think you have to fire to send the message? One, right? You fire one union supporter, and that chills the campaign. So retaliation against collective activity is really endemic. We at Jobs with Justice are paying particular attention to this issue of immigration and how are particularly vulnerable workers, immigrant workers, experiencing retaliation at work. So we've commissioned a study by the University of Illinois at Chicago, which they're conducting right now, to understand in workplaces where there are a significant percentage of immigrant workers, including undocumented workers, how are they experiencing retaliation when they're trying to come together collectively, not just for a union, but addressing issues through a worker center or other kind of collective action means. And what I just heard from the professor working on this, and he said they're starting to see a pattern among a lot of workplaces where what's happening is workers come to the union, they're complaining about harassment, they're complaining about some of the issues that Sue talked about, they're complaining about safety, and once word gets out that a set of workers have approached the union, the rumor mill starts. Well, we've heard that immigration authorities are in the area. And then the rumor mill turns into actual threats. Supervisors saying, look, I can't protect you if ICE comes, if immigration comes and knocks on your door. There's nothing I can do about it. Real threats. And then the next phase, typical union busting tactics, the kinds of things that Kate Bronfenbrenner has studied, anti-union videos, people get fired, the whole gamut. And then finally, workers are literally begging the union to go away. So, so you can see, the impact of that bullying is that one, the workers who are experiencing it very directly, the people who get fired, the people whose, this is a tactic by Walmart, reduce their hours, little things that add up, give them a heavier workload. Obviously it's detrimental to the person experiencing that. But what's the collective impact of that? Is that people don't want to form a union, they don't want to get together, they're afraid. And so, all it takes is Walmart to shut down a store in Quebec, which they did when they voted for a union, for every Walmart employee across the U.S. to get the message. And so you can see the collective impact of this, and this is why, a lot of us say this is why we have stagnant wages in this country. This is why we don't have people in unions. This is why we're really struggling as a workforce in this country, is because people are fearful of coming together, and employers understand the power of that collective action. So I don't want to leave on a depressing note. So what can be done? What can be done about it, right? So the first thing is we need to strengthen the law. Senator Patty Murray and Representative Bobby Scott last month just introduced what's called the Wage Act. Obviously not going anywhere in this Congress, but we need to start the conversation. The Wage Act would basically put teeth into the National Labor Relations Act and make it so that there's actual penalties and fines for firing employees who are trying to come together collectively, which right now there are not. You've got a lot of protections in discrimination laws, in wage and hour laws, but labor laws is completely toothless. And so this would really, if we were to win it one day, it would make a huge difference in actually protecting workers who come together. Something that we've done a lot at Jobs with Justice, Jerry mentioned, there has been an incredibly exciting uptick in collective activity. And, you've heard of the Fight for 15, I'm sure, the strikes that are happening in fast food. Fight for 15 has become a growing movement of not just fast food workers, but care workers, adjunct professors.
Adjuncts, yes.
People who all believe they deserve $15 an hour. They shouldn't have to work and also live on public assistance. And so we've, of course, those people are being retaliated against. And so something that we've done at Jobs with Justice is actually show directly for those workers who are impacted that the community is behind them. So we do what we call a walk back, where our folks, clergy in Missouri, will come together around with one of the workers who's gone on strike and literally walk them back into work the next day and say, talk to the supervisors, we're watching, we're with this guy, you know, he was brave, he took a stand, and we're watching to make sure that you don't retaliate against him. And those have been really effective in helping continue to give the workers confidence that, you know, and they are brave for doing that, but it gives them confidence, and it's actually, we think, has made an impact in preventing more bullying and retaliation. A second thing is just to actually, you know, we'll see if this is my theory, if this is right or not, but I feel like the more we make public union campaigns, I think the less likely employers are to do those kinds of tactics. So there have been recently very public union election campaigns at some of the new media outlets like Gawker and Slate, and they've been winning them. They've been winning unions in those places, and I wonder how much of that is because they've been publicizing their actual efforts before the vote. So I think there's something to spotlighting the campaign activity in a very public way that holds employers accountable. And then the last thing is, I think, just having a public conversation about what's happening when people take collective action. And I think there's real value in the labor movement exploring how we can be working with the Workplace Bullying Coalition and using bullying, that term bullying, in a way that helps it resonate with the public of what's happening in workplaces and how we have to protect people who are standing up.
Absolutely, that's great.
Yeah, so lots of good things, and the example that Aaron brings up with my students, I don't think we've gotten there yet this semester as I'm looking at some of you in labor relations, but you know, I call it the down by the river syndrome. So I borrow from Chris Farley and, you know, use the example of the union organizer that gets fired. You know, where do they end up? And in best case scenario, you know, it's 2-3 years before the labor board maybe gets them back to work and maybe gets them back wages. Of course, even with the back wages, they have to mitigate those back wages, which means they have to go out and try to find a job. So if they're making $7.25, $8, $8.50 an hour, you know, they have to mitigate that. And if they find a job for $7.25, that means the damages at best are $1 an hour, you know. And so the reality that I like to say is, you know, they end up in that van down by the river. And the coworkers see them living in a van down by the river. And, you know, and then if the employer was really, really bad, then the National Labor Relations Board will say, well, you also have to post notice about this violation. And, you know, and my perception is, well, now what the employer gets to do is they get to tell potential union organizers, if you organize, you're going to be down there with your friend who's living in a van down by the river. And here's the notice of what we did. So, you know, it's not, maybe not just, you know, lacking teeth, but, you know, sometimes can be even detrimental and work the opposite way of what it should. Before we move to questions, I just wanted to bring, in conversation, I wanted to, you know, bring a little bit of my research in here, directly dealing with workplace bullying and labor unions, and I take a little bit of a different position than Sue does, because I think Sue and the AFT have already been successful, at least in one battle, as I mentioned earlier. And, you know, and I think that based on my research, there are ways that unions can be successful in dealing with workplace bullying. And really, to me, ideally, laws need to happen. One of the chairs of my dissertation committee was Lance Compa, and he's always, you know, has the mantra of what we need for employment is strong laws, strongly enforced, and I wholeheartedly agree with that. And the second part of his mantra is that we need strong labor unions. And we do need a strong bullying law with strong enforcement. But we're years away from that. I mean, realistically. We're clearly nothing's getting through this Congress that has any type of workers' protections, as Aaron has pointed out. And so in the meantime, I see the most viable option of dealing with this through concerted activity. And I have experience seeing it dealt with through concerted activity. I think the AFT at West Virginia was a perfect example of how concerted activity and organizing can send a message to bullies and drive them out of the workplace at any level. And I think, you know, it's hard to ever say that this is definitely what happened, but I believe that the organizing drive and the focus on bullying behaviors from the university president at that university led to him leaving his position. And I can 100% guarantee you that the organizing drive and the focus on his bullying behaviors led to him retaliating against me and demoting me from the MBA director position, and which was grieved under state law, and we did win that grievance.
Well, we win a lot of grievances. I shouldn't say that we don't.
Right.
And when Jerry talks about getting rid of that particular president, it took a lot of effort. It took petitions, it took my going to the legislature and talking to legislators. It took his being so awful that the legislators also turned against him. It takes a concerted effort to achieve these things.
Yeah.
And everybody has to participate, which is why I get so frustrated when people just throw up their arms and quit, because we can't. What we're always trying to do, because we're non-collective bargaining and because only classified staff has protections in code, what we're always trying to do is to set precedent. If we're able to set a precedent, then we can turn to that over and over. What you have in many situations that you all know too well is minor fiefdoms. You have these little countries of just what Aaron's talking about, who get to do whatever they want. They can show you those videos. They can practically tie you to the chair. And, you know, I have a friend who was working in the mines, who was anti-union, his whole family was in the union. He was UMWA. He got promoted to fire boss, got sat down with all of those films, comes out of it telling me how awful unions are. And I'm like, what happened? And it's exactly those processes. But I also see, you know, even when people are not a member of the union, and even when they are told by their supervisors that if you join the union, you won't get tenure. If you join the union, this won't happen. Well, by God, everybody who is in the union doesn't get touched. It is the people who are not in the union who get bullied, who get fired, who get, with the exception of when Jerry was there, we had a really, 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 really horrible president.
Yeah. And you know, and I think the key to that, and the second piece of my research on unions and workplace bullying, is the idea of, that Sue mentioned, it has to be strong concerted activity. You know, one of the things that unions can't do, if they're going to be successful in addressing this, is to get caught up in the propaganda around, you know, the problems of targets. And what I mean by that is, you know, workplace bullying leads to really bad emotional and social and psychological outcomes for the targets. And it leads to things like being anxious, high levels of anxiety, leads to depression, leads to things that can be perceived from those on the outside as paranoia. And unfortunately, what I have also seen is at times that union leaders will buy into that. And so they will also say, well, the target's the problem. And sort of like the same thing that Aaron was talking about with the ICE raids. And so unions might buy into, well, you know, maybe you shouldn't be here in this country. And the reality is that in order to address this problem, union leaders have to stand strong. The second that they take a step backward, the second that they flinch when administration says, maybe this person's the problem, maybe this person shouldn't be working here, maybe this person's just paranoid, they can no longer deal with the problem effectively. But it's the unions that do stand strong, and I have seen those as well. And I've seen them where they have had collective bargaining agreements that directly address workplace bullying, but I've also seen them where there's not a single clause in the collective bargaining agreement. I was on the other side of the table, in fact, as an employee relations manager. And the union that I was dealing with, sheet metal workers in McMinnville, Tennessee, they came to me one of my first days on the job, and we were 18 months outside of a strike. We had 18 months left in our collective bargaining agreement. We had 300 plus grievances in backlog, and they came to my office and they said, fairly intimidatingly to me, I was in my 20s at the time, so it was an interesting experience, but they came to my office and they started, you know, they pointed the finger at me and they said, you know what, there's a supervisor in this plant who's an extreme, they didn't use the term bully, but they probably used a more colorful term for him. And they said to me, he's the #1 bargaining issue. And they said, if you don't want to strike, guarantee it right now, if you don't want to strike in 18 months, you're going to do something about him. You're going to address him. And there wasn't a day that went by when I was in that job that somebody from the union leadership didn't come up to me until we addressed that supervisor. So, and then 18 months later, when we sat down at the table, they must not have communicated well with their lead negotiator, their attorney. He came into the room, he slammed down his notebook on the table, and he said, we're not having a discussion until, I won't use the supervisor's name, I'll just use a fictitious name, until John is fired. And the union leaders stood up at the table and they said, no, it's all right. John doesn't need to be fired. They addressed him. They took care of the problem. He's no longer a bully in the workplace. But if they had not been doing that every day, with 18 months out, 300 and some grievances in backlog, looking at the fact that we just had a strike, looking at the fact that if we have another strike, corporate offices are saying we're shutting you down if you go on a strike, that would not have been our issue. It was their strong, concerted focus on him that led to us having to address the bullying. And if they had flinched, we may not have addressed it. And so it's important, but when they do, when unions do, when they're strong, when they're direct, when they focus on the rights of the target, they can address this. And they can address it in numerous ways, whether it's through the organizing drive, whether it's through collective bargaining, or whether it's through managing that contract. So, with that, what I'd like to do is to hear thoughts from audience as well as other the panelists will engage, and any questions, thoughts, comments for us.
I have a
Catherine.
question.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to play devil's advocate a little bit. I teach at 2 different community colleges in San Diego part-time, and I just kind of go and teach and leave, so I'm not really involved in the goings-on of these colleges. But at one college, we have a very strong union, and that college has a really terrible workplace culture. All day long, I get emails of reply to alls of people who seem to hate working there, and they hate the way they're treated and all this kind of stuff. But I feel like it's not the administration necessarily that's the problem, it's the union. That they're the ones who, they make my workplace via email pretty upsetting. I don't want to read them anymore because it's all about I deserve this and this and that. And then the other community college, the union's there, but they're not so give me, I deserve this. And that workplace is very positive. All the emails are like, look what we're doing, and this is fun, and look at, you're all invited, and it's very different. So from my own personal perspective, I feel like the union is part of the reason we have a really terrible workplace at the one community college. So I was just curious what your thoughts
I would like to respond to that because the union is its members. And there is no union out there controlling everything, and it does not. I'm sorry about your experience the negative experience at that one community college, but most of us who are union leaders are very careful about the emails that we send out that are mass emails. And we are also very careful about trying to get private email addresses so that we can do union business separately and not publicly that way. It sounds to me as though union members and perhaps the union leaders at that particular institution are causing themselves trouble. And I will also say that sometimes one is unaware of what is really going on in an institution from an adjunct position.
Right.
And but it is unfortunate. I was thinking about some things that Aaron was saying too. One of the best things that we have as a weapon to be used sparingly, is to publicize poor behavior. Whether we do an editorial in a paper, whether we get the paper to come cover an event or something like that, when we make it public, since, and again, I'm only speaking from university standpoints, it seems to me that most universities, state universities anyway, are operating on the assumption that if you say one negative thing about us, we die. Therefore, nothing negative is supposed to go out about the institution. So when we do something that exposes a behavior, it has a large impact. So we don't do it often. But that institution should also have policies and procedures in place that don't allow individuals to whine in a massive email to everybody there. That should be a violation of policy. So you can't control how each individual union operates. Generally, though, my belief and my experience with unions is they generally work for the good of all. And even if you're not in a union, what I do for union members spreads out through the institution and through the state.
Yeah.
So it is unfortunate if you've got a union behaving that way. In general, my experience with unions has been they are the most democratic process, they are the most fair process, and they are the most morally high-minded process that I've experienced.
Yeah. I think it's like the people at the one negative one have gotten so lost that they're just.
They
so
need a better
deep in
leader
it.
is what they need right now.
I feel like the ones that are kind of doing it probably need to, like, go get a job somewhere else, and we need a new batch of union people.
You know, I mean, you need better managers too.
Yeah.
I mean, we are a union workforce at Jazz with Justice. I'm on the management side, which is interesting for me. But we have a union. We have had to terminate people who were not good fits for the organization. You can terminate somebody who's in a union. I mean, this is we had this conversation last night. Sometimes the bullies are protected by the union. Well, actually, all you have in a contract is what's called a just cause provision, which means that there's a process that the manager has to take before you can be fired. So you have to just give a verbal warning and then, a written warning, and then you can be terminated unless it's for some discriminate, and union can grieve it, but you can fire somebody in a union contract. Would you rather have some, make it a little more difficult to fire people, or be what most Americans are, which is at will, which is you can be fired for no reason at all. And so, I always feel I'd rather, err on the side of making things a little harder. But, a better manager over there would root out some of what's happening and take, and just follow the contract and getting people out that shouldn't be there in that area, or, improve their policy on the use of email too. So it's not that there's
It's
steps
really-
you can take.
Doesn't that violate sort of freedom of speech though, to say?
No, not a company.
Policy on
No.
No, company
how
email.
much you can email.
And recognize that having procedure in place, I have to say two things about this. The union has to represent all members. So even if a member is a complete jerk
Yeah, that's right.
and a complete lazy bum, I have to represent that person because that is a union member. That is my job, no matter what, even if it makes me choke, right? But secondly, if your institution has policy and procedure that you cannot be fired just because I don't like your jacket today, kiss the ground, because that's going away in any right-to-work state. Everybody's an at-will employee, and we're fighting right to work now, and it is appalling. And you may have union members whining, or your union whining, and it's really gross and it's irritating and all that kind of stuff, but at least they can and not be fired, apparently. In many places, people come into my office, close the door, and whisper. That's how scared people are generally in their workplace. That's happening. there's a loss of control both at the administration
Yeah.
level and at the union level. But, you know, that's unfortunate, too bad. Most unions, I just love them.
So, real quickly, I just wanted to add to that, and then we'll get there. And I, you know, with psychiatrists and psychologists in the room, I don't want to diagnose a union without having met them and talked to them. So I'll just throw out two other possibilities here. I mean, one thing that's important to keep in mind, when a union wants to activate and mobilize members, or when a union wants to organize workers, they absolutely have to bring to attention problems in the workplace. So, you know, part of this could be trying to activate members to point things out. I mean, like it or not, at least from my perspective, the American workers are like the frog in the pot of water
That's right.
being boiled. Although I've been told that that's actually biologically a fallacy and the frog would jump out anyways. But the American workers don't seem to want to jump out of the hot water. So sometimes unions have to bring up the point of this is a problem. Second thing is there are union problems too within labor unions, and one of those is definitely when union leaders get into power and then take steps simply to maintain their power rather than to do what the members want them to do, which the union, to Sue's point, the union is the members, but sometimes leaders lose sight of that and they become the union. So one of the things I would be interested in diagnosing this union would be how do they refer to the union? Do members refer to the union as them, meaning the leaders? Do leaders refer to themselves as the union? Do they talk about the union in a third person? And if so, we might have problems with oligarchy. And then questions over here.
I was just going to comment that I'm glad that you said that you have to represent everybody. I was hired for a not-for-profit in upstate New York. We had a union in one area of our organization, and the rap was the bully in that group. They had never had human resources. I was brought in, you know, under the mantra of dignity and respect. The union worked with me. They recognized that, but they could not address the bullying. And so we were able to work because I put in the dignity and respect. That was what all managers had to work from. And this bully did not. And we were able to work towards it that way. The union, you could almost see them. They wanted to say, I'm sorry.
Yes.
You know, they kept coming to me, but
Yes.
they worked so well because they saw that I was recognizing I'm not in here to cause problems. I'm here to try and fix the problems we have. They had to represent this person.
That's
They
right.
didn't have a choice.
That's right.
And my boss was getting mad at them and mad at the union, and I kept saying, they don't have a choice, just like I would have to go forward with you. You know, we have to address the problem, not
And
union versus
unions work with
employer.
administrators. They work with you to try to come to a resolution that is something that everybody can live with. Everybody's trying to do that. We're all trying to work together and make everything more comfortable and so forth. But you run into human problems. You run into people who become an idea that is unbending. Yes, sir.
Over here first, and then we'll over here, and then over there. Okay.
Just a quick question. I consult with an employee assistance program. I'm pretty familiar with the employee assistance programs. I was a director of one. I worked with human resources, and I'm going to this is kind of a theoretical. I'm thinking globally, hopefully because we're talking about acting locally here. Here's my question. We work with, the employee assistance program is for behavioral health, consulting, any type of leadership training, a lot of things that they do, mainly for workplace health and safety. So one of the things that I continually bring up when I'm supervising folks is, how is it, and I'd be curious as to where this goes from a theoretical point of view, if you ask the union what it is that they want safe, healthy, and productive workers. You ask management what they want, and guess what? We want safe, healthy, and productive workers. So my question from a theoretical standpoint, because this always comes up in the presentations that I do, how did we get from the exact same concept, objective, to now we're talking, and just listen to the words we've used: strike, mobilize, there's this kind of aggressive fight, us against them. Jerry just brought it up. Do we look at ourselves as the union, the leader? There's the separation, it's divide and conquer. It's now become, and that goes back to class, here comes warfare. You see how, and yet they start out at this concept, we all want the exact same process for our workers as ourselves. How did we get so far apart is what they keep asking me. I'd love to hear it. But,
I've done some research on productive labor management relationships, and often it gets to that really critical conflict point before both sides are able to see this is a waste of time and resources for everybody. And people aren't familiar with the Federal Mediation Conciliation Service. It's a government federal agency, but they're often brought in major situations like that, big employers. And what they try to do is take labor management through what's called an interest-based bargaining process, or where it's really about like, look, we have a lot of mutual interests, and you've named them there, that we can actually work towards. And when it's usually a neutral party like that, and they're able to ultimately, the key thing that we found is build trust between the employees, the managers, the union, corporate headquarters, or even in many cases public employers. If you can build that trust, then you can develop what can be a really great relationship. Which, Ford Motors, that UAW and Ford have a great partnership and have brought them through a lot of hard times. And so, we try to promote those positive stories where we can, but it's often unfortunately reaches a really ugly point before you get to that, where actually, they can see, let's work together on this.
It's like you have to get their attention.
I'd like to speak to that also and recognize that I am always the negative person in the room, despite I like to laugh,
You have a great laugh.
Thank you. But in any case, when I first joined the union and I first joined our Central Labor Council, UMWA people would talk to me about how terrible bosses are and how they're always going to do the worst thing and blah, 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 blah. And I sat there like, at that point, incredibly innocent and naive and thinking my administration would never do that and my people are nice and what are you talking about and you're just paranoid. But then you get this blend that has happened in our country of the moneyed interests buying the politicians. And what I see happening in West Virginia, what happened last year, was they rolled back mine safety laws to 1920. And they're going to do worse this year. And this is in alliance with the corporations, if we can understand that. And if you look at Patriot, declaring bankruptcy so they can take the pensions of the workers. It is very difficult in those situations for me to say we're both on the same side. It is very difficult when I was in an actual legislative session where what the Republican proposing the rollback of a particular law, he came out and said, this will save the company 1 penny each week. So it's okay for the miner to die because I will save 1 penny, God damn it, excuse my language, a week. I cannot believe at that point that that corporation wants safety, wants healthy and happy workers.
Oh, I agree, Sue, and I think that's the point. Where's the canary in the coal mine, using that same analogy? How did it get to that point? Because clearly, at that point, as far as I'm concerned, no prisoners. You've got to do exactly what you do for human dignity, for the rights of people, as well as the worker. I mean, workers are people, by the way. But the bottom line, though, is what happened between that and where that is. And see, that's the part that I think there are missed opportunities, that's all I'm suggesting.
Lifted regulations, started on.
But again-
Lifted regulations.
Okay, we all know the problem, so where is, how do you solve it? How do you prevent it? That's my whole
I would just
process.
add one thing real quickly, and then I want to get to Shelley's question, and then, so we can get to the next session. But, you know, I don't think there's ever been that connection. I think the idea, to be honest with you, for the vast majority of employers saying that, historically, it's BS. Because
Thank you.
before the labor movement, what did we have? We had child labor, we had people dying every day, we had Press Steel Car Company that people would die at the company just down the road in Pittsburgh, and they would burn their bodies so that people didn't know they were dying. We had stagnating wages, we had incredible levels of wealth, while we had this other group of the vast majority of the country living in terrible poverty. Then we had the labor movement. And to quote, paraphrase again, quote A. Philip Randolph, you know, there's nothing that workers have ever gotten that they didn't have to fight for. Nothing's been given to them. And so from 1935 to 1973, workers fought. And that's when we started to see this leveling of where everybody seems to be on the same page. Employers seem to want safe, healthy workplaces, and employees clearly want safe, healthy workplaces and decent wages. Then we see, you know, things like the PATCO busting and firing of those workers, and the message to employers, go after unions, do what you can. And the reality is we now have 40 years of stagnating wages. We now have 10 years of college graduates' wages stagnating and declining. We now have more workers working in poverty level wages than we've had since the Gilded Age. And we have the record level of inequality to show, and at the same time we see employers left and right fighting safety regulations that are simple safety regulations that are ridiculous. Norina Hertz, you know, did a study looking at asbestos removal and points out in the 1980s when workers were removing asbestos, they had full equipment on. And now she goes into the field and they're wearing bandanas around their face, which does nothing to protect. And why are they doing it? Because employers have mandated it. They don't want the health and safety.
Yeah, I mean, you only see positive relationships where there's that balance of power, you know?
Yeah.
That's,
What it is.
and that's what you need.
Yeah.
That's what you need.
So I
So,
just have
final
a
question, go.
very, very quick question for the union, for Susan. My daughter works for, I don't know if I should say the name of the company or not, but, okay, blah, blah. She works in pathology. Her immediate boss is actually, doesn't have a degree and doesn't actually know how to do pathology. But in this medical world, he's what I call your toxic leader.
Yes.
And he has actually sexually harassed my daughter. And I've been teaching and encouraging her how to manage this through. The doctors that, of course, head this department, she finally went to them. Actually, somehow, some way, well, she went to one of them, told them the story, and long story short, because I could take all day explaining this, but I won't. She ended up leaving this particular city that she's working in and taking a different job in a totally different county, but it's also a different union. Although this company has unions everywhere, she was afraid to go to the union because the union was in with administration.
Oh,
And in this new union, she's lost seniority. She's worked for this company for 14 years, but in the new union, she's lost seniority. She is in a very dysfunctional situation now because the process is missing. The people are great, but the process is missing. And she got a call from this administrator HR who said, we understand there's been an issue. And she's frozen. I've said, you have to support whatever you told the doctor. That's what you need to do. My question for you then is, had she stayed in this position over in this union, what are some actions she could have taken? I want to see if they're parallel to what I recommended, even though she chose.
well, I
not to
don't,
out of
you know,
fear.
every situation is different. But I would go to my local leader first, and if your local leader doesn't help you, you go to your regional leader. Then you head on up the chain. But I would certainly do it in such a way that you leave a paper trail,
Yeah,
that you,
the problem is that She's afraid to. That's the whole retaliation.
It's the
So that's
retaliation
why I
thing,
just said we need to
and if HR wasn't gonna help her where she was, that's a problem with HR.
Yeah.
If you have, you know, it's what I mean by all these little fiefdoms operating all over the place. We have an HR at my institution that is free and easy with every law. They will call on a law when they want to get rid of somebody. They will ignore the law when they don't want to get rid of somebody. Your daughter, I know the fear of retaliation, and it can ruin a life.
Yeah, no, that's why I think it's our job, because it was clear that it was.
But again, my experience, it's just my experience, and it's very limited. When you stand up, things happen.
Yeah.
And you have to stand up, and you have to stand up publicly. If working with HR doesn't help you, if pulling in the union and HR together doesn't help you, you are living in a situation where they're the wrong people in those positions. And the only way is for herself, your daughter herself, to become a leader, and your daughter herself to begin the fight and to gather other people to fight with her, and other people who've had the same experiences as she has. And it is unfortunate, and I also know how hard it is for everyone to expect you to do it. As I said, it's very hard to get people to stand up, because I'm supposed to do it for them. And I do it to the extent that I can, because I'm happy to do it, and because I get angry at how people are treated. I get really angry. But if you don't get more than one person in this fight, she's hanging by a thread, you know? And I know you're gonna have something to say about that.
So at what point would you go to the media, and or, if that was an option, or at what point would EEOC be brought in?
There you go. There you go.
Well, those are very much along the lines of what I told her, is EEOC,
Or an
go to your
employment law
union,
attorney.
get your other 4 people that have been affected, involved.
And we
Now that
had,
she's in the other area, I think she'll feel more comfortable, and now that they've contacted her, I did exactly that. I said, you need to become the leader, you need to get your facts, you need to document it. It just so happened she did speak to a paralegal.
document.
Reached out to a paralegal, documentation, so hopefully something will change.
But remember these little fiefdoms. I mean, our
Yeah,
person
that's
who
my
was the
concern.
EEOC contact person, representative, whatever, was also the provost of the institution, so she could stop everything from going to EEOC. So there are places that are so corrupt,
Yeah.
inside out,
Right.
that fighting them is so, you turn yourself into a pretzel, but you turn yourself into a closed pretzel. And that's when you have to go outside, you have to go to media, you have to go to national EEOC or something. You have to get beyond what's at your local institutional level. And Shelley's looking at me like, this would never happen. I'm telling you, gosh, it happens. And it is horrifying, and these cultures that exist that are so local and so self-sustaining are terrifying to fight.